Betrayal doesn't just sting, it leaves a permanent, humiliating scar, especially when flaunted under oath. Picture a packed Chicago courtroom where a grieving widow sits in stoic silence while her late husband's much younger, designer-clad mistress laughs in her face, laying claim to an $80 million empire. Smug grins and whispered insults fill the heavy air as the other woman parades her apparent victory, utterly convinced she has erased 3 decades of marriage with a single, freshly inked document. She thought she had won the ultimate prize. But arrogant people always overlook the fatal details. Cook County Probate Court was a room practically designed to suffocate hope. The air was stale, smelling faintly of lemon polish and decades of broken families. Dust motes danced in the harsh beams of morning sunlight cutting through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the stark divide between the plaintiff and the defense. On the left sat Catherine Davenport. At 55, she possessed a quiet, understated elegance that came from a lifetime of hard work and quiet endurance. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her silver-threaded hair pulled back into a neat, unpretentious clasp. Her hands resting on the mahogany table were still too still. They were the hands that had typed the first invoices for Davenport Logistics 30 years ago in a freezing, uninsulated garage in Evanston. They were the hands that had packed her husband's suitcases for endless business trips, and the same hands that had signed the mortuary release forms when Charles Davenport suffered a massive, fatal coronary event 3 months prior. On the right sat Chloe Harrington. Khloe was 27. Radiating the kind of aggressive, weaponized youth that demanded immediate attention. She wore a pristine, stark white Alexander McQueen suitor, bold, almost theatrical choice for a probate hearing, and a heavy gold Cartier Panther necklace that Charles had purchased for her during a business conference in Dubai. She leaned back in her chair, casually crossing her legs, occasionally leaning over to whisper into the ear of her high-priced attorney, Gregory Lawson. Whenever she did, she would cast a sidelong, pitying smirk in Catherine's direction. "Your Honor," Gregory Lawson began, his voice a booming baritone that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He paced confidently in front of the bench. "We are here today to honor the final, undeniable wishes of a visionary man. Charles Davenport was a titan of industry, but in his private life he was a man suffocating. For years he was trapped in a loveless, hollow shell of a marriage. It wasn't until he met my client, Ms. Chloe Harrington, that he finally experienced true companionship, vitality, and love." Catherine didn't flinch, though a sharp ache radiated behind her ribs. Loveless. The word echoed in her mind. Just last Christmas, Charles had cried into her shoulder after their golden retriever passed away, whispering that she was the only anchor he had left in the world. Now, this slick lawyer in a $3,000 suit was rewriting 30 years of her life for the public record. Lawson dramatically lifted a clear plastic sleeve containing a single crisp document. 2 weeks before his tragic passing, Mr. Buths, Davenport of sound mind and absolute clarity, executed this last will and testament. In it he revokes all prior wills, including the outdated document drafted in 2010. He explicitly leaves his controlling shares of Davenport Logistics, the Winnetka estate, the portfolio of offshore accounts, and the entirety of his liquid assets to the sole woman who brought joy to his final years, Chloe Harrington. The document is signed, dated, and witnessed by 2 impartial associates. From the defense table, Chloe let out a soft theatrical sigh, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. When she lowered the tissue, she looked directly at Catherine. The mistress's lips curled into a tiny, mocking smile. It was a look that explicitly said, "I took him, I took your life, and there is nothing you can do about it." Judge Harrison Gable, a stern man with 30 years on the bench and a reputation for having absolutely no patience for courtroom theatrics, adjusted his glasses and peered down at the document. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge rumbled, turning his gaze to Catherine's lawyer, "does the defense have any opening remarks before we proceed with the petitioner's testimony?" Arthur Pendleton stood slowly. He was in his late 60s, a veteran litigator with a slightly rumpled grey suit and a demeanor that always seemed perpetually unimpressed. He didn't pace. He didn't bellow. He simply buttoned his jacket and looked at the judge. "We do, Your Honor," Pendleton said softly, his voice carrying a rasp that commanded absolute silence in the gallery. "The defense intends to prove that the document currently held by Mr. Pounsid, Lawson, is not only fraudulent in its emotional inception but entirely superseded by facts that Ms. Harrington and her counsel have carelessly overlooked. We will show that Charles Davenport did not view the petitioner as his savior, but rather as a highly expensive, deeply regrettable mistake." Khloe scoffed loudly, a sharp, abrasive sound that drew a glare from the bailiff. She leaned into the microphone at her table, ignoring her lawyer's desperate hand gesture to stay quiet. "He called her a dusty antique to my face," Khloe whispered, though the microphone picked it up perfectly, broadcasting the insult throughout the courtroom. "She's just mad he upgraded. Miss Khloe Harrington," Judge Gable snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "You will speak only when spoken to, or I will hold you in contempt before this trial even begins. Do you understand me?" Khloe batted her eyelashes, feigning innocence. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm just so emotional." "Save the performance for the stage," Judge Gable replied dryly. "Call your first witness, Mr. Lawson." Naturally, Lawson called Khloe to the stand. The strategy was clear. Paint her as a devoted partner, the tragic surviving soulmate, and legitimize the sudden change in the will. As Khloe took the oath, her hand resting on the Bible, Catherine finally let out a long, shaky breath. Arthur Pendleton leaned over and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Let her talk," Catherine Pendleton whispered, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous, calculated light. The higher the pedestal she builds for herself, the further the drop. For the next 2 hours, Chloe Harrington spun a masterclass in manipulation. Guided by Lawson's gentle, prompting questions, she painted a picture of Charles Davenport that Catherine barely recognized. According to Khloe, Charles was a man desperate for adventure, a man who felt chained down by a wife who refused to attend galas, who hated travel, and who only cared about hoarding his wealth. Khloe described their clandestine trips to Paris and St. Bart's, emphasizing how Charles would constantly complain about Catherine's dreary personality. "He told me, just days before he died," Khloe said, her voice dropping into a breathless, dramatic register, "that he was staying with Catherine purely out of guilt. He said she was fragile, but he promised me that his legacy belonged to the future, not the past. That's why he signed the new will. He wanted me to take care of the companies, to modernize them. He trusted me." Lawson nodded sympathetically. "And the signing of this new will on October 14th? Could you describe his demeanor that evening?" "He was relieved," Khloe lied smoothly. "He signed it at my penthouse in the Gold Coast. He poured us a glass of vintage champagne, looked me in the eyes and said, 'Finally, I am free.' He knew Catherine would fight me out of spite, but he told me not to worry. He said his lawyers made the document bulletproof." Lawson turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Gable said, "your witness." Arthur Pendleton took a slow sip of water, picked up a thin manila folder, and walked toward the podium. He didn't look at Khloe immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, flipped a page, and adjusted his reading glasses. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, forcing Khloe to shift nervously in the witness chair. "Miss Harrington," Pendleton began, his tone conversational, almost polite, "you've painted quite a vivid picture of Mr. Davenport's final weeks. You claim he was miserable with his wife of 30 years, yes?" "Yes," Khloe answered sharply, her confidence returning. "Miserable. Miserable. And you claim he entrusted you with the future of Davenport Logistics, a company that currently employs over 4,000 people. Tell me, Miss Harrington, what was your role at the company before you transitioned into Mr. Davenport's private life?" Chloe's jaw tightened. I was a senior marketing coordinator. A coordinator, Pendleton corrected gently. Hired 6 months prior to the affair. Yet your Sir Charles believed you were capable of running a multinational logistics empire? Charles believed in my potential, she snapped. Unlike his wife, who doesn't even know how to send an email. She shot another triumphant smirk at Catherine. I see. Pendleton flipped another page. Let's talk about the night of October 14th. The night this so-called bulletproof will was signed. You stated earlier that Mr. Davenport came to your Gold Coast penthouse, which he paid for, correct? And signed the document in front of 2 witnesses. That is correct. These witnesses, Pendleton said, reading from a sheet, a Mr. Davis and a Mr. Butt. Vance, pardon me, a Mr. Miller, both of whom happened to be personal trainers at your luxury gym. Did Charles Davenport, a man who retained a team of 12 corporate attorneys, explain why he chose 2 random gym employees to witness the most important document of his life? Khloe crossed her arms defensively. He wanted it kept secret from Catherine's spies. He trusted my friends. Fascinating. Pendleton took off his glasses. Miss Harrington, are you familiar with the Continental Bank branch located on LaSalle Street? Now, Khloe blinked, clearly thrown by the sudden change in direction. Her eyes darted briefly toward Lawson, who frowned, equally confused. I know where LaSalle Street is, yes. Specifically, I am asking about safety deposit box number 814, Pendleton continued, his voice dropping slightly, forcing the courtroom to lean in to hear him. Did Charles ever mention this box to you? Khloe hesitated. The arrogance faded for a fraction of a second, replaced by greedy calculation. If there was a safety deposit box, there were more assets. He might have. Yes, he told me about it. He said whatever was in there was mine. Are you absolutely certain about that, Miss Harrington? Under penalty of perjury? Yes, Khloe said, her voice rising. He told me he had a private box. He gave me the key. He explicitly told me, Khloe, the contents of my private box are for you to secure your future. He gave it to me the night he signed the will. Pendleton's demeanor instantly shifted. The polite, older gentleman vanished, replaced by the apex predator that had made him the most feared probate lawyer in Chicago. He gave you the key, Pendleton repeated, his voice echoing in the dead, silent room. Yes. To box 814 at Continental Bank. Yes. I already said that, Khloe huffed, rolling her eyes. Are you getting hard of hearing, Mr. Pendleton? Judge Gable slammed his gavel. Ms. Harrington, one more remark like that and you will spend the night in lockup. Answer the question directly. I answered it, Khloe muttered, glaring at the judge. He gave me the key on October 14th. Arthur Pendleton turned slowly, walked back to the defense table, and picked up a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside rested a heavy, antique brass key. He held it up by the plastic corner. Your Honor, Pendleton said, his voice ringing out clear and cold. The witness has just testified under oath that on October 14th, Charles Davenport handed her the only key to safety deposit box 814. She has testified that he told her the contents were hers. Pendleton walked closer to the witness stand, locking eyes with a suddenly pale Chloe Harrington. Which is truly a medical and physical miracle, Miss Harrington, Pendleton said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. Because safety deposit box 814 does not belong to Charles Davenport. It belongs exclusively to Catherine Davenport. She opened it 22 years ago. Charles never had legal access to it, nor did he possess a key. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Chloe's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Lawson sprang to his feet. Objection. Relevancy. Counsel is badgering the witness with trickery. Lawson shouted, his face flushing red. Overruled. Judge Gable barked, leaning over the bench, his eyes fixed on Khloe. The witness introduced the claim under oath. "Mr. Pendleton, where are you going with this?" "I am establishing a pattern of perjury, Your Honor," Pendleton said smoothly, never breaking eye contact with the mistress. "Ms. Harrington just lied effortlessly about receiving a key to a box that doesn't belong to her deceased lover purely out of blind greed, which brings us to the actual documents Charles Davenport signed on October 14th. And more importantly, the document he signed exactly 3 days later." Chloe's arrogant smirk completely vanished, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization that the ground beneath her designer shoes had just disappeared. The absolute silence that fell over Cook County Probate Court was so profound that the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a roar. Chloe Harrington sat frozen, the color draining from her face with the speed of water emptying from a shattered glass. The designer white suit she wore suddenly looked less like a victory gown and more like a surrender flag. At the defense table, Gregory Lawson desperately shuffled his papers. His previous theatrical confidence entirely evaporated. He ran a hand over his slicked back hair, knocking it out of place. "Your Honor," Lawson stammered, his booming baritone reduced to a reedy squeak. "My client was clearly mistaken. Grief can severely cloud the memory. She meant another box, or perhaps a home safe. To accuse her of perjury over a simple numerical confusion is highly prejudicial." Judge Harrison Gable leaned over his elevated desk, glaring down at Lawson over the rim of his spectacles. "Mr. Lawson, your client did not just mistake a number. She testified under oath that she was handed the physical key to a specific asset she claimed your late client owned. A key that, as Mr. Pendleton has just demonstrated, unlocks a box belonging exclusively to Catherine Davenport, a box opened when your client was still in elementary school. I will not tolerate blatant fabrication in my courtroom. If I hear one more fabricated excuse from that witness stand, I will have the bailiff place her in handcuffs. Am I abundantly clear?" "Crystal clear, Your Honor," Lawson mumbled, slowly sinking back into his leather chair. Catherine remained perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap. She didn't smile, nor did she gloat. The betrayal of her husband still cut deep, but watching the architecture of Chloe's lies begin to collapse offered a cold, clinical satisfaction. Arthur Pendleton, however, was just warming up. He picked up a heavy, blue-backed legal binder from his table. It was thick at least 50 pages of dense, heavily notarized text. He walked toward the judge's bench with the measured, deliberate steps of an executioner ascending the scaffold. "Your Honor, the defense would like to enter into evidence Exhibit D," Pendleton announced, handing a copy to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. He then turned and dropped a duplicate copy onto Lawson's table. The heavy binder hit the mahogany with a resounding thud that made Chloe flinch. "What is this, Mr. Pendleton?" Judge Gable asked, putting on his reading glasses and flipping open the cover. "That, Your Honor, is the Catherine Davenport Irrevocable Living Trust," Pendleton explained, projecting his voice so every spectator in the gallery could hear. "Executed, signed, and deeply authenticated on October 17th, exactly 3 days after the fraudulent will presented by Miss Harrington." Chloe's head snapped toward her lawyer. "What is he talking about?" she hissed frantically, her manicured nails digging into Lawson's forearm. "He didn't sign anything else." "He was with me." "Tell them he's lying." Lawson ignored her, frantically scanning the first page of the document. As his eyes darted back and forth across the legal jargon, a visible sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Objection," Lawson whispered before clearing his throat and trying again, louder. "Objection. We had no prior discovery of this document. This is an ambush. You had no prior discovery, Counselor, because the trust was filed under seal by Mr. Dewar, Davenport's private corporate counsel, explicitly to prevent your client from discovering it before this very hearing," Pendleton countered smoothly. "Judge, if you will direct your attention to page 4, section 2, you will find a sworn affidavit attached to the trust. It was dictated by Charles Davenport himself, in the presence of a senior notary and a court-certified stenographer. Judge Gable turned to page 4. The courtroom waited in breathless anticipation. Even the court reporter seemed to type softer, not wanting to miss a single syllable. "Would you care to read the highlighted portion to the court, Mr. Pendleton?" the judge asked, his tone suddenly very grave. "I would be honored," Pendleton said. He retrieved his own copy, opening it with practiced ease. The affidavit reads, "I, Charles Edward Davenport, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that the last will and testament dated October 14th, which names Chloe Harrington as the primary beneficiary, was signed by me under extreme duress, emotional manipulation, and profound false pretenses." Chloe gasped loudly, a hand flying to her throat. Pendleton didn't pause. "I had recently become aware of a systematic, deeply deceptive scheme orchestrated by Ms. Harrington to siphon corporate assets and isolate me from my legal wife, Catherine. I signed the October 14th document solely as a decoy. I did this to pacify Ms. Harrington and prevent her from causing immediate harm to my company's reputation, while I quietly and permanently transferred the entirety of my estate or liquid assets, real estate holdings, and my controlling 92% share of Davenport Logistics into an irrevocable trust. The sole uncontested beneficiary of this trust is and forever shall be my wife of 30 years, Catherine Davenport." Pendleton snapped the binder shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Charles Davenport realized he had made a terrible, foolish mistake, Pendleton said, his eyes locking onto Chloe's terrified face. He realized he was being played by a predator, and he spent the final 2 weeks of his life ensuring that the predator would walk away with absolutely nothing. "Mount. Hats. Alco. Chloe leapt up from the witness stand, her pristine composure entirely shattered. Her face was flushed dark red, a stark contrast to her white suit. "That's a lie!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "He loved me. We were going to Paris. He hated that old woman. You forged that." "Order! Order!" Judge Gable roared, violently slamming his gavel. "Bailiff, restrain the witness." A burly sheriff's deputy stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Chloe's shoulder, forcing her back down into the wooden chair. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting wildly around the room as the reality of the situation began to crush her. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Gable said, his voice lowering to a dangerous rumble, "these are incredibly severe allegations. You are claiming that the petitioner was actively defrauding the deceased prior to his death." "We are, Your Honor," Pendleton nodded calmly, "and we have the receipts to prove it." The defense calls its next witness, Mr. Thomas Reynolds. Thomas Reynolds walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom with the weary, no-nonsense demeanor of a man who had spent his entire life untangling the dirty secrets of the wealthy. He was a forensic accountant and licensed private investigator, a man whose tailored navy suit and meticulously organized briefcase radiated absolute authority. As Reynolds took the oath and settled into the witness stand, Catherine allowed herself a small, big breath. Charles had been deeply flawed, vain and susceptible to flattery, but he had also been a ruthless businessman. When cornered, Charles Davenport didn't just fight back. He annihilated his opponents. Pendleton approached the podium. "Mr. Reynolds, could you state your profession for the record?" "I am a senior partner at Reynolds & Vance, an independent financial forensics firm," Reynolds stated, his voice a dry, clinical monotone. "I specialize in asset tracking, corporate fraud, and offshore fund recovery. And on October 2nd of this year, did you receive a call from Charles Davenport?" "I did," Reynolds nodded. "Mr. Davenport contacted me via his private line. He sounded highly distressed. He suspected that someone within his inner circle was embezzling funds from the Davenport Logistics marketing budget, specifically routing money through a shell vendor. He hired my firm to conduct a quiet, aggressive audit." "And what did this audit uncover?" Pendleton asked. Reynolds opened a sleek black folder and extracted a stack of bank statements. We uncovered a textbook invoicing fraud scheme. Over the course of 8 months, exactly $1.4 million had been funneled from the corporate accounts to a fictitious public relations firm based in Delaware. We tracked the routing numbers from Delaware to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Khloe was no longer looking at the gallery, nor at Catherine. She was staring straight down at her lap, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Did you identify the ultimate beneficiary of that Cayman account?" Pendleton asked, though everyone in the room already knew the answer. "Yes. The account was registered under a holding company called Harrington Future Ventures. The sole signatory was Chloe Harrington," Reynolds replied. The gallery erupted into furious whispers. Judge Gable banged his gavel twice, demanding order. "Fascinating," Pendleton noted, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "So, Miss Harrington was not just a romantic companion. She was actively stealing from the man she claimed to love. But the deceit goes deeper than just corporate theft, doesn't it, Mr. Reynolds? Mr. Davenport asked you to look into her personal life as well." "Duh." "He did," Reynolds said. "Once we uncovered the financial fraud on October 10th, Mr. Davenport requested a full background check and surveillance on Miss Khloe Harrington. Let's revisit the events of October 14th, Pendleton said, turning toward the judge. The night the fraudulent will was signed. Miss Harrington testified that she had 2 impartial associates, a Mr. Davis and a Mr. Miller, witnessed the signing. Mr. Reynolds, did your surveillance uncover anything notable about Mr. Coffin?" "Derek Miller?" Reynolds pulled a glossy 8x10 photograph from his folder and handed it to the bailiff. "Derek Miller is a personal trainer, yes. But he is also Miss Harrington's long-term romantic partner. They have shared a residential lease in Lincoln Park for the past 3 years. The surveillance photos, time-stamped the morning of October 12th, show Ms. Harrington and Mr. Miller celebrating at a high-end brunch establishment. We acquired security footage of them reviewing the very draft of the will that Mr. Davenport eventually signed on the 14th. Lawson put his head in his hands. He was a lawyer who billed $800 an hour, and he had just realized his client had walked him blindfolded into a minefield. "Let me ensure I understand the timeline, Mr. Reynolds," Pendleton said, raising a finger to outline the trap. "On October 10th, Charles Davenport discovers his mistress is stealing millions from him. On October 12th, he receives proof that she is conspiring with her secret boyfriend to seize his entire estate. Why then would he go to her penthouse on October 14th and sign a will giving her everything?" "Because I advised him to," Reynolds stated, matter-of-factly. "When Mr. Davenport discovered the betrayal, he wanted to call the police immediately. But as a forensic accountant, I warned him that if he tipped her off, she could easily wire the stolen $1.4 million to an untraceable crypto wallet before the authorities could freeze the Cayman account. Furthermore, corporate attorneys advised him that a messy public lawsuit would tank Davenport Logistics' quarterly stock valuation." Reynolds adjusted his microphone, his eyes locking onto Khloe. "We needed time. We needed to freeze the offshore accounts, gather ironclad evidence, and legally shield his entire estate. Mr. 1. Sherison Davenport went to her penthouse on the 14th and signed that useless piece of paper to give her a false sense of security. He played the part of the smitten fool perfectly. She was so blinded by her own greed and the illusion of victory that she didn't realize the Cayman account had been frozen by federal authorities on the morning of October 16th. Khloe let out a choked sob. The Cartier necklace around her neck suddenly looked heavy, like a glittering noose. "And on October 17th? Pendleton asked softly. "On October 17th, knowing the trap was completely secure, Charles Davenport signed the irrevocable trust, placing every single asset he owned, down to the wristwatch he was wearing, into the sole possession of his wife, Catherine," Reynolds concluded. "He was preparing to hand the embezzlement file over to the district attorney when he suffered his fatal heart attack." Pendleton turned back to his table. Catherine was looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was a complex, tangled grief. Her husband had broken his vows, yes. He had strayed into the arms of a younger woman to chase his fading youth. But in his final days, when the illusion shattered, he had spent his last ounce of strength building an impenetrable fortress around the woman who had built his life with him. He had chosen to protect Catherine. "Your Honor," Pendleton said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. The petitioner, Chloe Harrington, did not just present a will that was superseded by a later trust. She actively conspired to defraud a dying man, engaged in grand larceny, and then walked into your courtroom today and committed perjury on multiple fronts. The defense rests, and we humbly request that this court not only dismiss the petitioner's claim with extreme prejudice, but also forward the transcripts of today's proceedings to the state's attorney for immediate criminal investigation. Judge Harrison Gable did not speak immediately. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in Cook County Probate Court was the heavy rustling of paper as the judge flipped through the Reynolds and Vance forensic audit. Every turning page sounded like a nail being driven into Chloe Harrington's coffin. Gregory Lawson, the high-priced attorney who had strutted into the courtroom 2 hours earlier, acting as if he owned the building, was now visibly trembling. He possessed the acute, terrified awareness of a man who had just realized his client had strapped a proverbial bomb to his chest. Assisting a client in presenting a fraudulent will was grounds for disbarment. Presenting a fraudulent will while the client was under an active federal investigation for grand larceny meant prison time. "Mr. Lawson," Judge Gable finally said, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifying, gravelly register. He removed his glasses and pinned the lawyer with a glare that could have melted steel. "Did you have any prior knowledge of this offshore holding company, or the fabricated nature of the October 14th document?" Lawson jumped up so fast his heavy leather chair skidded backward and slammed into the wooden partition. "Absolutely not, Your Honor," he stammered, raising both hands as if to physically push the accusation away. "I was retained purely for the probate hearing. The petitioner explicitly assured me, repeatedly and in writing, that the October 14th will was the only binding document. I had absolutely no knowledge of the Cayman accounts, the Delaware Shell Company, or the personal trainer." Chloe snapped out of her paralyzed state. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, wild and uncoordinated. "He's lying," she shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at her own lawyer. "He told me to push the narrative. He said if we painted Catherine as a bitter old hoarder, the judge would rule in my favor. He knew about Derek. That is a categorical falsehood." Lawson roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He turned to the judge, his breathing shallow. "Your Honor, in light of the undeniable evidence of fraud, grand larceny, and perjury committed by the petitioner on this very stand, I find myself in an ethically impossible position. I am formally requesting to withdraw as counsel for Ms. Harrington effective immediately." The gallery broke into a chorus of shocked murmurs. An attorney abandoning his client in the middle of a hearing was the legal equivalent of throwing someone out of a life raft into shark-infested waters. "Request granted, Mr. Lawson," Judge Gable ruled without a second of hesitation. "You will, however, remain in this courthouse. I am instructing the bailiff to confiscate your briefcase and all communications between you and Miss Harrington. The state's attorney will determine if you were a victim of your client's deception or a willing accomplice." Lawson swallowed hard, nodding mutely. He gathered his coat, stepped away from the defense table, and walked to the back of the courtroom, leaving Chloe sitting entirely alone at the massive mahogany table. The stark white Alexander McQueen suit suddenly made her look incredibly small and utterly isolated. "Please," Chloe sobbed, turning her tear-streaked face toward the bench. The arrogant smirk from earlier that morning felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. "Your Honor, you have to understand. Charles manipulated me. He was older, he was powerful, he groomed me into this lifestyle. He promised me the world, and then he set me up. I'm the victim here. Judge Gable leaned over the bench, his expression devoid of a single ounce of pity. "Ms. Harrington, you are 27 years old. You're not a naive child," the judge stated coldly. "You orchestrated a complex financial embezzlement scheme involving interstate wire fraud and offshore accounts. You conspired with a secondary romantic partner to steal a multinational corporation. You then walked into my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and lied through your teeth to disinherit a grieving widow." The judge picked up his gavel. "This probate petition is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The Catherine Davenport Irrevocable Living Trust is recognized as the sole uncontested legal authority over the estate of Charles Davenport," Judge Gable announced, his voice ringing with finality. "Furthermore, based on the sworn testimony and financial evidence provided by Mr. Reynolds, I am holding you, Chloe Harrington, in direct civil contempt for rampant perjury." He gestured to the two burly sheriff's deputies standing near the walls. "Bailiff, take the petitioner into custody. You will hold her in the county lockup without bail until the district attorney formally files the criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Court is adjourned." The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. The deputies moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. One grabbed Chloe by her left arm, the other by her right. "No, no, please." "I don't want to go to jail," Chloe screamed, thrashing against their grip. A heavy gold Cartier panther necklace snagged on the collar of her suit, snapping with a sharp metallic clatter. Golden links scattered across the scuffed linoleum floor. "Derek, call Derek. He has to fix this." "Ma'am, stop resisting or we will add an assault charge," one of the deputies warned roughly, forcing her arms behind her back. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs echoed through the room. Arthur Pendleton stood calmly at the plaintiff's table, packing the heavy blue binder back into his leather briefcase. He didn't look at Chloe, he looked at Catherine. "It's over, Catherine," Pendleton said softly, his raspy voice gentle for the first time all day. "The company is safe. The estate is secure. She will likely spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." Catherine looked at the empty space where her husband used to sit at the dinner table in her mind's eye. She felt a strange hollow lightness in her chest. She had won. The empire they had built in a freezing Evanston garage was entirely hers. But the victory required wading through the absolute ugliest parts of the man she had loved. "Thank you, Arthur," Catherine whispered. "For everything. Take a moment." The old lawyer smiled kindly. "I'll wait for you out in the hall." The gallery cleared out quickly, the spectators eager to rush into the hallways and gossip about the spectacular implosion they had just witnessed. Gregory Lawson had already been escorted away by a clerk. Soon the massive wood-paneled courtroom was empty, save for Catherine, Arthur Pendleton waiting by the heavy double doors, and Chloe Harrington, who was slumped in a wooden chair by the defense table, waiting for the transport van to arrive. Chloe was a mess. Her perfectly styled hair was plastered to her wet cheeks, a designer mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her face. Her wrists were bound behind her back. She stared blankly at the scattered gold links of her broken Cartier necklace on the floor. Catherine Davenport stood up. She buttoned her charcoal blazer, picked up her sensible black leather handbag, and walked slowly across the aisle. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the linoleum, a measured, deliberate sound that made Chloe flinch. Catherine stopped 3 feet away from the younger woman. She didn't bloom. She didn't cross her arms. She simply looked down at the mistress with a calm, clinical curiosity, like a scientist examining a particularly destructive insect trapped in a jar. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with a toxic mixture of terror and lingering venom. "Are you happy now?" Chloe spat, her voice a ragged, ugly croak. She tried to sit up straighter, clinging to the last shredded remnants of her pride. "You get to keep the money. You get to keep the big empty house, but he still came to my bed, Catherine. He still hated his life with you. You can't erase that. Catherine's expression didn't change. She didn't flush with anger, nor did she shed a tear. The utter lack of emotional reaction seemed to unnerve Khloe more than if Catherine had screamed at her. You never understood Charles at all, did you, Khloe? Catherine said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and terrifyingly even. Khloe sneered. I understood exactly what he wanted. He wanted youth. He wanted fun. Things you dried up and lost 20 years ago. Charles was a deeply insecure man, Catherine corrected gently, as if explaining a basic math problem to a slow child. He was terrified of aging. You were just a mirror he bought to reflect a lie back at him, a very expensive, very temporary mirror. But you made a fatal miscalculation. I made a mistake trusting Derek, Khloe muttered bitterly, looking away. No, Catherine stepped slightly closer, forcing Khloe to look her in the eyes. Your mistake was assuming that because Charles was foolish in his private life, he was foolish in his business. You thought you were the predator. You thought you were hunting a slow, aging antelope. Catherine let out a small, dry exhale that was almost a laugh. Charles built Davenport Logistics by ruthlessly crushing anyone who tried to take what was his. Catherine continued, her tone hardening into cold steel. When he found out you were stealing from him, you stopped being his fantasy. You became a liability, and Charles eradicated liabilities. Khloe opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. The memory of Charles smiling at her over champagne in her penthouse, kissing her cheek while he signed the fake will, knowing full well he was setting her up for federal prison, finally clicked into place. The sheer sociopathic calculation of it made her physically shudder. He didn't do it for you, Khloe whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't set the trust up to protect you. He did it to punish me. Perhaps, Catherine conceded softly. Charles was a complicated, flawed man. He broke my heart, Khloe. I will not pretend he didn't. But when the illusion shattered and he realized he was dying, he looked at his life's work. And he didn't trust his legacy to the woman he was sleeping with. He trusted it to the woman who built it with him. Catherine reached down and picked up one of the broken gold links from the Cartier necklace. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, inspecting it for a second before dropping it into Khloe's lap. You thought you were stealing my husband, Catherine said, her voice dropping to a harsh, final whisper. But all you really did was steal my garbage. And now, you are going to pay for it for the rest of your life. Nam, transport is here, the deputy interrupted, stepping forward and grabbing Khloe by the bicep, hauling her roughly to her feet. Khloe didn't fight this time. The fight had been entirely drained out of her. As the deputy marched her down the center aisle toward the holding cell doors, she looked back over her shoulder one last time. Catherine Davenport had already turned her back. She was walking toward her returning, her spine perfectly straight, her head held high. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright, bustling hallway of the courthouse, leaving the mistress behind in the shadows. The doors swung shut, sealing the courtroom and ending the chapter of Charles Davenport forever. Catherine had a company to run. 6 months later, the sweeping glass walls of the Davenport Logistics boardroom offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Chicago skyline. Rain lashed against the reinforced panes, blurring the city into a wash of gray and steel. But inside, the atmosphere was charged with a crisp electric focus. Catherine Davenport sat precisely at the head of the 20-foot mahogany conference table. She had traded the quiet, understated charcoal blazers of the probate courtroom for a sharply tailored, midnight blue Armani suit that commanded absolute authority. Her silver hair was styled with a modern, elegant edge. The trembling, stoic widow from 6 months prior had completely vanished. In her place sat the undisputed chief executive officer and sole chairwoman of a $3 billion empire. Spread out before her were the quarterly financial projections. Around the table sat 12 senior vice presidents, most of whom were men Charles had hired during his midlife crisis phase, men who prioritized flashy marketing over logistical efficiency. For the past hour, they had been sweating through a brutal, systematic restructuring meeting. "Let's review the East Coast distribution nodes," Catherine said, her voice calm but carrying a sharp edge that instantly silenced the room. She tapped a silver pen against a printed spreadsheet. "Mr. Higgins, your department requested a 15% budget increase for third-party fleet maintenance. Yet, looking at the raw data from the Philadelphia hub, our truck idle times have increased by 20% since you outsourced the mechanical work to a vendor in New Jersey."
"No, that's
Fuck. Robert Higgins, a slickly dressed executive who had openly scoffed when Catherine first took over the company, swallowed hard. "Well, Mrs. Davenport, the logistics of that transition were complicated. The vendor assured us the vendor is overcharging us by $200,000 a quarter for preventative maintenance they aren't actually performing," Catherine interrupted, sliding a secondary file down the polished table until it stopped exactly in front of Higgins. "I know this, Robert, because 30 years ago I personally balanced the maintenance ledgers for our very first fleet of 6 trucks. Mechanics do not charge premium union rates for brake pad inspections that take less than 12 minutes. You didn't audit them. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. "You will terminate the New Jersey contract by Friday," Catherine instructed, leaning back in her chair. "You will promote the internal maintenance crew leaders in Philadelphia to regional managers, and you will give them the budget you were wasting on that vendor. If I catch another unaudited invoice passing through your department, Robert, I won't just fire you. I will ensure you never work in logistics in the Midwest again." "Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am," Higgins muttered, his face entirely drained of color. "Excellent. Meeting adjourned," Catherine said, closing her leather portfolio. As the executives quickly filtered out of the room, eager to escape her scrutiny, the heavy glass doors opened to reveal Arthur Pendleton. The veteran lawyer carried his signature-worn briefcase, though his usual severe expression was replaced by a warm, genuine smile. "You're terrifying then, Catherine," Arthur chuckled, pulling out a chair and sitting down near her. "I passed Higgins in the hallway. He looked like he just survived a bear attack." "Charles let them get lazy," Catherine replied, a faint smile playing on her lips as she poured 2 cups of black coffee from the carafe on the table, handing one to her attorney. "He was too busy funding penthouse leases to notice the operational bleed. I'm just cauterizing the wounds. What brings you out in this rain, Arthur?" Arthur set his briefcase on the table and clicked the brass latches open. He withdrew a single thick manila envelope and slid it toward her. "The state's attorney finalized the plea agreements this morning," Arthur announced, taking a sip of his coffee. "I thought you would want to hear the details firsthand." Catherine's hand paused over the envelope. The ghost of Chloe Harrington had lingered over the past 6 months, a dark cloud tied to endless depositions, asset freezes, and FBI interviews regarding the Cayman Islands accounts. "Tell me," Catherine said quietly. "Derek Miller flipped almost immediately," Arthur explained, leaning forward. "Once the Fed showed him the wire transfers, the personal trainer realized his loyalty to his girlfriend didn't extend to doing federal time. He handed over all their text messages, the encrypted emails, and the draft documents they used to forge the October 14th will. He took a plea deal for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 3 years in a minimum security facility. And Chloe." Arthur's smile widened just a fraction. Without her co-conspirator, her defense completely collapsed. A new public defender advised her to take a plea rather than face a jury. Federal Judge Sarah Jenkins, who notoriously has 0 tolerance for white-collar embezzlement, threw the book at her. "How long?" 74 months, Arthur said, the satisfaction evident in his raspy voice. "A little over 6 years in a federal penitentiary in West Virginia, plus court-ordered complete restitution. They seized the Cartier jewelry, the designer wardrobe, the vehicle Charles bought her, and liquidated her personal bank accounts. She walked into that prison wearing standard-issue khaki, completely bankrupt." Catherine looked out the window at the rain-slicked city. She thought about the arrogant, sneering girl in the pristine white Alexander McQueen suit, mocking a grieving widow on the stand. She thought about the cruelty of the words Khloe had weaponized, so certain that youth and manipulation were unbeatable currencies. "Justice is rarely this thorough," Catherine murmured, looking back at Arthur. "It is when the victim refuses to play the victim," Arthur corrected gently. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "The estate is entirely settled, Catherine. The company is completely in your name. There are no more lawsuits, no more hidden accounts, no more ghosts. You are entirely free. Thank you, Arthur, for navigating the darkest part of my life with me." After Arthur left, Catherine remained in the boardroom alone for a long time. She eventually packed her things and took the private elevator down to the underground garage. A driver took her north, away from the glittering skyscrapers back to the massive Winnetka estate. Walking through the heavy oak front doors of the mansion, the house felt overwhelmingly quiet. For months after Charles died, the silence had felt like a crushing weight, a constant reminder of his betrayal and his absence. But tonight, as she walked through the grand foyer, the silence felt different. It didn't feel empty. It felt clean. She walked into Charles' old study. The walls were still lined with his awards, his leather-bound books, the expensive scotch he collected but rarely drank. Catherine walked over to his massive oak desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the blotting pad was the heavy, antique brass key to Continental Bank's safety deposit box 814. Catherine picked up the key, turning the cold metal over in her hands. Charles had used her devotion as a shield to protect his legacy from his own terrible mistakes. He had broken her heart, but in the end he had handed her the sword to defend herself. She dropped the key into the wastebasket beside the desk. She didn't need it anymore. The box was empty, the accounts were settled, and the past was finally buried. Catherine Davenport walked out of the study, turned off the lights, and closed the door without looking back. Tomorrow she had a company to run. The trail often wears a glittering mask, but truth always holds the master key. Chloe Harrington believed her youth and manipulation were enough to steal a lifetime of hard work, only to discover that arrogant predators inevitably walk themselves right into the perfect trap. Catherine Davenport's silent strength and ultimate triumph prove that true power doesn't need to shout from a witness stand. It patiently waits for the right moment to strike. If this courtroom drama kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to help support the channel. Share this story with anyone who loves a brilliant twist and watching karma deliver absolute devastating justice. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the shocking real-life consequences of greed and revenge. Let us know in the comments below, do you think Charles Davenport was a genius for his final trap, or a coward for leaving the mess to his wife?